A primary mandate we all share is the desire to live a full, meaningful human life. And the most essential requirement we all face is the requirement to know ourselves.
Who are you? What is a human? Does how we answer these questions change how we experience life, how we understand our own minds? Where do the concepts that we use to break up and analyze our own experiences come from? Psychology, the internet, books, friends? How could we think about ourselves differently? According to Ferdinand de Saussure, the objects and ideas that structure our worlds do not have an independent existence. They are historically specific, created by the social circumstances we inhabit. The way we think about the world is structured by language. We can only separate a tree from the ground because we have a word for it. The world is not made up of logically ordered, separable, essential objects. It is divided by our perception, determined by categories we impose. The world outside of this dividing process of representation is both unreachable and meaningless. This forces us into a mode of analysis that attempts to historicize objects rather than understanding their essential characteristics. This is what history does. By analysing concepts like family, emotion, or morality as they are produced by historical conditions, we can develop a view of reality that attempts to trace concepts rather than endlessly pinning them down. We can become more aware of the limits placed on our own understandings by our circumstances. This framework can be applied to how we understand ourselves and the concepts we draw on to break down our own minds. I explain my feelings using a series of categorized emotions, such as happiness, sadness. I explain my choices with a particular theory of autonomy and free will. I evaluate myself according to a series of values, morality, resilience, intelligence, and so on. Daily, I take these categories to be essential, but they are paradoxically historical. They are developed under specific conditions and constantly limit how I can see myself. For Louis Althusser, our self-understanding is something deeply ideological. There is no ideology except for concrete subjects, and this destination for ideology is only made possible by the subject, meaning by the category of the subject and its functioning. For Althusser, the idea of the subject is historically specific. Ideology has the primary focus of creating human beings that act and think in specific ways, creating specific categories of subjectivity that set boundaries on action. His famous example is that of being called on the street. In the moment that you turn around, you're being hailed or interpolated, recognizing your existence as a human subject, separate from the world and with a series of characteristics. Here, what constitutes a human is something incredibly historically specific. It is created by our interactions, forged when we are named at birth and inculcated into a series of categories and systems. Hélène Cixous applies this analysis to literature. It would appear that subjectivity as reality is continuously worked over by fiction. Characters in literary texts present particular forms of humanity, but we also interpret them according to our pre-existing notions of what people are. We use words to construct concepts of people, imagined people that then influence how we think about the world. We apply these versions of the subject to those we know in real life, categorizing and understanding their actions according to complex codes that are historically specific. When I've been addressing you in this video, have you been conforming your perception of yourself to fit the categories that I'm incidentally imposing? Have you been thinking about your own self, understanding it in separate ways, understanding yourself as someone who watches particular kinds of videos, does particular things with their time? How much can our understandings of ourselves change in relation to advertising, films, and conversations? To trace one example, the idea of autonomy is one value that we often use to explain our actions. This concept does have a specific history. In The Social Contract, Jean-Jacques Rousseau creates a particular idea of the subject based on this idea of autonomy. This is a Greek word that breaks down into autos, self, and nomos, law, or self-rule. In attempting to reconcile human individuality with the constraining demands of collective life, he argued that rule could only be just if citizens created the laws for themselves via a majority vote that he called the general will. He used this to distinguish between two types of freedom: natural freedom, which has no limits other than the individual's power, and civil freedom, which is limited by the general will. Friedrich Neuhauser argued that in doing so, Rousseau develops a particular model of the subject, a particular way of being human that he ranks more highly than others. This form of humanity involves parsing through your desires and selecting which are the most just according to an external criterion, not doing whatever your desires tell you, but controlling them. This idea of self-governance and control still resonates with how I tend to think about myself and my actions. These historical ways of understanding ourselves are widespread and open up many possibilities for interpretation in philosophy and literature, and in films and psychoanalytics. A popular recent example is the idea of the inner child, which has been talked about a lot on the internet. What theory of the subject is implied by this? It suggests that there is something truer than our external self, the self that we show to others through our actions, that something essential exists within us, some series of qualities that exist independently of time and can be treated and healed. There is a lot of overlap between this idea and that of the soul. The more fundamental question is about the value of these categories. If the ways that we live life are incredibly contingent and historically specific, how can we be sure that they are useful or good? Any criteria we use to rank these categories will be equally as historically specific. Happiness, productivity, or cooperation are all equally contingent concepts. Can we adjust how we think about ourselves to fulfill external functions? Should we? Or should we just continue to build ourselves out of the concepts provided to us by our social world? Whether self-understanding is possible, or whether we can only constantly reconfigure ourselves in ways that align with differing criteria, is a constantly relevant question.